This is the I Will Teach You a Language podcast, episode 150.
Welcome to the I Will Teach You a Language podcast, weekly motivation and language learning tips to help you become fluent in any language. Now, here's your host, Ollie Richards.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the I Will Teach You a Language podcast. It's Ollie here. I am very, very happy to have you here, as always, and episode 150, kind of a landmark, I guess. 100 was the big one. I guess, what's the next one going to be? 500? 1,000? We'll see if I make it. Today we've got a fantastic question all about the way that different cultures and people who speak different languages look at the world differently. It's really, really fascinating. We're going to be talking about the ways of expressing time with a very special guest. Before we do that, I'd like to thank the sponsors of the show, who are italki.com, and italki is where I get all of my language lessons from. And if you would like to get a lesson with a native speaker teacher with the language you're learning, you can go to iwillteachyoualanguage.com/free lesson. But without any further ado, let's dive straight into today's question from Tadeusz.
Hi Ollie, I'm Tadeusz from basically Denmark, but I was born in Poland and I'm back in Poland for the time being. So I've been studying Chinese on and off for quite a few years now, but I'm still very much puzzled by the notion of time in Chinese. In the West, we see time as moving forward. So I have my future in front of me and my past behind me. But in Chinese, it seems to be the opposite. So if I had to say 5 years ago, it would be 5 years in front. 五年前, and in 5 years would be 5 years behind. That's very confusing for a Western mind. And it applies to many other notions of time in Chinese. Would it be the same in Japanese or Thai? Please comment a bit about that. And thank you for the wonderful work you are doing for us independent language learners. Hi, Ollie.
All right, thank you very much for a fascinating question, and it's something that I can definitely relate to because having learned a lot of Asian languages myself, these little things can be quite confusing at times. You know, how to express basic concepts that we might be familiar with in a certain way differently. Now, as I'm not a Mandarin speaker myself, I thought that I would get a little bit of help from an expert to help answer this question so that we can really get to the bottom of this concept of time and how to express it in Chinese. And this is none other than Chris Parker. You might recognize Chris from my Language Learning Foundations course. I did a masterclass with Chris where he gave a lot of really, really great tips about learning Chinese and languages in general. Now, we did have a little bit of background noise here during our conversation, and there was also a little bit of a delay on the line, so we do talk over each other from time to time. So apologies in advance for that. Chris runs a site called fluentinmandarin.com, and I began by asking him if he could just summarize this issue of time and how to express time in Chinese.
Yeah, well, if we go back to the question, the original question was about the person was asking, he was saying that basically 5 years ago in Chinese appears to be 5 years in front, and 5 years in the future appears to be 5 years back. Whereas in English, it's almost like the future has to be ahead of you and the past is behind you. But in fact, it's not entirely. That's not really the situation because. I think the person asking the question here has got slightly confused with looking into this in a lot of detail. But essentially, in Chinese, just as he said, for example, if you want to say 5 years ago, you'd say 五年之前 in Mandarin or 你之前 in Cantonese, which is the same thing. So it's literally 5 years behind or 5 years. It's literally 5 years in front or 5 years before. So if you think about this as 5 years front, it sounds like it's in front, but that's not the case. It's actually 5 years before.
So I guess the confusion here then is actually in other ways of using the word which accounts for time, right? So in that case, you've got the word for. So I'm not so familiar with the Mandarin version, but you've got this word which can be used in different senses, and so what you're saying is that whereas because this word can be used meaning in front of you, as in physically facing you.
Yeah.
That kind of seems to correspond with the way that we talk about time in English, saying that, that time is in front of us. So, 5 years from now is in front of us. But actually we've got a couple of different meanings going on here. Is that right?
Yeah. So it seems to be the opposite, but in fact it's not, because if you think about the word like front, like in front of you, if I was to say you're standing in front of me, I could also say you're standing before me. Like in an old-fashioned way of saying it. So, in fact, this concept of in front and before is actually the same, whether it's in Chinese or in English. So, in fact, when he's saying 5 years ago, 五年以前 in Mandarin, or 五年之前 in Cantonese, it's actually saying 5 years before. And then 5 years in the future would be 五年以后 in Mandarin, or 五年之后 in Cantonese, and that would be literally 5 years after, or 5 years. So he's confusing this with another word which means behind, but actually this word means after. So in fact, it's 5 years after. So 5 years in the future in 5 years' time is 5 years after.
Right, and we've got exactly. He also asked about other language, and it's exactly the same in Japanese, isn't it? So if you were going to say 5 years ago, you've got gonen mae.
Yeah.
And then gonen go, which is exactly the same usage of those words in between Japanese and Chinese, which is
so 5
really
years before or 5 years after.
Yeah, and guys, if you want to look at the examples that we're giving here, we're going to put all these in the show notes, which are going to be at iwillteachyoualanguage.com/episode 150. So if you're struggling to follow along, then definitely have a look at the show notes.
I think that's going to make it a lot less confusing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but we can also apply this concept to other areas of the language, right? And so, what's another linguistic area where we're referring back and forward in time?
So maybe actually I can talk about the years first, because in Mandarin, if you want to say the year before last, it's 前年, which means the year before, the year that comes before. And then 去年 is last year, which is literally the year that's gone or the year that's left. And then we have 今年, which is this year. And then 明年, next year, which are just standard words for this year and next year. And then the year after next year is 后年, which in Cantonese is 好年, right? It's the same as the word for after that we had before. So it's the year after next means literally after year means the year after next. So that's kind of similar. And then we also have the weeks and the months in Chinese. And so if you want to say this week, it would be 这个星期 or 这个礼拜 in Mandarin. And in Cantonese, it would be 呢個星期 or 呢個禮拜. So that's this week. And then if you wanted to say last week, it would be in Mandarin 上个星期 or 上个禮拜. And in Cantonese, it would be 上個星期 or 上個禮拜, which literally means the week on top or upper week. So if you wanted to say next week, it would be basically lower week or the week below. So in Mandarin, that would be 下个星期 or 下个禮拜. And in Cantonese, it would be 下個星期 or 下個禮拜, the lower week or the week that comes below. So if you're talking about the weeks, it's almost like they're on a scale of up and down. So this week is in the middle, and then last week is on the top, and next week is on the bottom. And it's the same for months as well.
This is something that I find myself kind of pausing from time when I'm speaking Cantonese. I find myself pausing to think, to kind of remember this concept of up and down or higher and lower in order to express the time. It's kind of, I think it's
months.
I've certainly weeks and months. Yeah, I've certainly found that the imagery of it very, very important. But I mean, Chris, like, just taking a step back a second. I mean, do you think, like, to what extent is it when in your own learning, to what extent did you find that you were kind of learning these concepts by study and analysis, if you like, or to what extent did you find you just kind of picking them up through speaking? Because I have a very clear
yeah.
view on that, but I'm just curious about what the process was like for you, if you can still remember. I imagine it's some years ago.
Yeah, I think when I was first learning, probably I could see the character that it was like the week, the upper week or the week above, and maybe a teacher said that. But most of the time when I was saying it or thinking about it, I didn't think about that concept. I literally just learnt it as a set phrase, and then I've just used it so many times that I don't really think about it. It means the upper week or the lower week. I just know that last week is 上个星期 or 上个礼拜. I don't think about the concept anymore, except when I have questions like this and I have to like analyze every little thing. But normally I don't really do that so much.
It's funny because I'm kind of taking it the same way around, because I learned Cantonese just by speaking. And so I'm only now kind of setting out to learn Chinese characters in more depth. And so I'm kind of now like I can sort of say all these things because I've just said it so many times. But I'm just now sort of finding that I'm looking at characters and thinking, oh, right, that's what it means, sort of thing.
Yeah. I guess one exception would be the months, because in Chinese the month, it's like January is literally 1 month, 2, and February is 2 months, 2 and then month. So that's the same in Cantonese, Mandarin, and probably the other Chinese dialects as well. But when I'm speaking, I probably do actually think of the number as well. So October will be 10 months. So I might actually think about that, because when you're writing a date, you actually write the number as well. So that might be an exception, but that's slightly different.
Yeah. Well, yeah, which I guess is a concept you find in other languages as well, such as like numbering the days of the week, which you find in a lot of Western languages as well. Day 1, day 2, day 3, and so on.
Yeah, but in the Western languages, the months aren't really numbered like clearly like that. Whereas in Chinese, and I don't know about other Asian languages, but certainly in Chinese dialects they are.
Yeah, well, exactly the same in Japanese as well. Okay, so one last thing that we wanted to give a quick example of, and it's about books.
Yeah, so this example was, I was saying that often in Chinese, if you have a series of, for example, books or films or something that comes in 2 sections or 2 parts, you could just say, instead of dividing these parts into part 1 and part 2, often you would say 上 and 下, which would be the upper and the lower. And then maybe if there were 3, you could also add middle into the middle. You could say 上, 中, and 下. Or in Cantonese, that would be 上, 中, and 下. So you would divide them into the upper, the middle, and the lower. So that's just another thing that you find in Chinese as well.
Yeah. What happens if you want to make part 4?
Then you wouldn't be able to use this system. It would have to be you'd have to go back to numbers and things. But if it's just 2 parts, you'd often see this, like in books, a series of books, or sometimes films as well.
Yeah. So, Chris, that's really, really interesting. It's great to hear this clarification of the. It's almost a way of looking at the world, isn't it? The way that sometimes we see something in one way, but then other people see time and space in a totally different way, and it's so fascinating to sort of to learn more about that.
But what I would say is it's basically just a different way of looking at essentially the same thing, or a different angle of looking at the same thing. It's not like it's backwards in Chinese to what it is in Europe, or it's completely just turned on its head. It's not like that. It's almost like just a different angle of looking at something, or a different perspective.
It's one of the fascinating things about getting to know other cultures, isn't it? But I think, like, broadly, if we take a little bit of a step back, I think the advice we'd have to give is always with, the concepts we're talking about here, expressing time. It's such a fundamental part of daily speech that, I mean, certainly from my perspective, the way to approach this is not to overanalyze. The way to approach it is actually to get out there and use the language as much as possible. And if you do that, you'll very quickly just find that the words, it's like muscle memory. You just learn the words. And the confusion really, really stops. Chris, thanks so much for your time.
Be aware of it, but don't overanalyze, yeah.
Yeah, well, exactly. Thanks so much for your time, Chris. It's been great to have you on the show finally. I've been meaning to invite you for some time. Where can people find out more about you and what you do with languages online?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. And yeah, if you want to find me, you can just go to my website, www.fluentinmandarin.com. or you can search for my YouTube channel, which is also called fluentinmandarin.com. So you can find me in either of those places. And I've got resources for Mandarin, a lot of videos about Mandarin, and I'm also just starting to produce some materials for Cantonese as well. So check me out
lovely.
there.
Fantastic. Well, I'll certainly be spending a bit of time over there. Okay, thanks, Chris. Talk to you soon.
Yeah, thanks, Ollie.
So I hope you enjoyed that chat with Chris from fluentinmandarin.com. Definitely go and check out all the great resources he's got over there. Chris has got a gift for explaining what is a difficult language in very clear terms, and I really appreciate that about Chris and everything he does. So if you would like to ask me a question, you can go to iwillteachyoualanguage.com/ask, where you can leave me a voicemail, and I'll get around to answering it sooner or later on the show. We've got quite a few questions in the queue, but I always get round to them eventually. So if you do leave a question, it will be asked. Now, as I mentioned in the chat today, we've put all of the examples that we've given here in the show notes, written in Chinese, so that you can really just look at them in your own time and absorb and digest what we've been talking about. So if you'd like to look at the examples from the discussion, please go to the show notes. You can find them at iwillteachyoualanguage.com/episode 150. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next episode of the podcast.